Welcome to this Introduction to Music Fundamentals B video, where we'll be concentrating on triad quality and also an introduction into four-part harmonization. You'll remember from previous videos that I have explained that there are different qualities of triads. Just like we have different qualities of intervals, you'll remember that in intervals you could have a major, minor, diminished, augmented, or perfect triad. Interval. In triads, we have something similar. Triads can be major, minor, augmented, or diminished. But you'll notice that there's no perfect kind of triad. We don't call triads perfect, only major, minor, augmented, and diminished. The different types of triads are labeled differently. So in Western classical music, a major triad is always written with Roman numerals in capitals. So if you look at the screen now, you'll see I've used chord 4 as an example. Chord 4 written in capitals means that it's a major chord. If the chord is minor, we write it in Roman numerals in the lower case. So you'll see the example there, 2. If a chord is augmented, then the Roman numerals must be in capitals and a little plus sign to the right-hand side. You can see if you look at the screen now that there is chord 3 and a tiny plus on the right-hand side. If the chord is diminished, it is also in Roman numerals but lowercase, and then next to the chord on the right-hand side, a small 0 sign. Okay, it's as easy as that. If we're writing them out in jazz, the major chord is just on its own. You'll label the chord like C, for example. If there's nothing written next to it, we're just assuming that it's a major chord. If the chord is minor, then you need to write M-I-N next to it. So, for example, A-min. A-min means A minor. If the triad is augmented, then there are two ways of writing it. Either you can write E plus with a tiny plus, for example, or A plus or G plus, whichever the chord is, but the plus indicates that it's augmented. Or you use the little abbreviation aug, like E aug. Either of those would be acceptable. A diminished triad, there are two ways that you could do it. You simply go M and a diminished sign. So BM diminished would be B minor diminished, or just B dim, B diminished. Okay, so these are the conventions that we use. Remember that the major chord, it's just on its own, C. If it's minor, then you add the abbreviation min. If it's augmented, you add aug or a tiny plus. If it's diminished, the small 0 sign, M0, or just dim. Now let's look at the qualities of each triad. A major triad consists of a major third at the bottom and a perfect fifth. Let's think about C major triad that we were looking at in the previous videos. C, E, G. Now if we were working in C major, C to E is a major third. C, D, E is a major third. Okay, so the bottom third of the chord is major. If we look at the E to the G, though, we'd see that that was a minor third. But if we look at the C to the G, C, D, E, F, G, we see that it's a perfect fifth. So a major triad is a major third, is the first interval, and a perfect fifth. C to E is the major third, C to G is the perfect fifth. A minor triad is when you have a minor third at the bottom of the chord and a perfect fifth. So let's stay with C so that you can see what the difference is. A minor triad on C is C, D, E flat. Instead of E natural, E flat. And the perfect fifth is C to G. So a minor triad on C would be C, E flat, G. An augmented triad is when the third at the bottom is major and the fifth is augmented. Remember, you can have a perfect fifth or an augmented fifth, which means that it's bigger. So if we were working with C again, an augmented triad on C would be C to E is a major third. C to G sharp is an augmented fifth. So it would be C, E, G sharp. That would be an augmented chord on C. And then a diminished triad is where you have a minor third at the bottom and a diminished fifth above it. So let's try C again. C to E flat is a minor third. We've already discussed that in the minor chord. And C to G flat is a diminished fifth. So a diminished chord on C would be C, E flat, G flat. That is how you would have the diminished chord. So let's have a look at those chords that I've just been speaking to you about as written out now. You'll see that the major triad is a major third at the bottom and a perfect fifth. The minor triad is a minor third at the bottom and a perfect fifth above that. The augmented triad is a major third at the bottom and an augmented fifth above that. And the diminished triad is a minor third at the bottom and a diminished fifth above it. Now, when we are labeling triads, let's just see what they would look like. And I just wanted to give you an example of these. Here, I've included both the Western staff notation and the jazz versions so that you can see them. Just as a note, remember, I've said this before, but when you're using Western staff notation, the labeling comes underneath the chords, but when you are using jazz notation, they come above the chords. Also, another important thing is that when you are using Western staff notation or Western classical music, the Western classical version, you also have to state the key at the beginning. So when you look at the screen now, you'll see that the key is stated from the beginning, D major, okay? Let's have a look at these chords starting with the jazz notation. You'll remember that in jazz notation, a major chord is always just the chord's name on its own. So in D major, chord 1 is a major chord, so it's just D. Chord 2 in a major key is always minor, E minor. Chord 3 in a major key is always minor, F sharp minor. Then chord 4 is major, G. Chord 5 is major, A. Chord 6 is minor, B minor. And chord 7 is always diminished. C sharp diminished. You see that little diminished sign, and then chord 1 again. In the bottom, if we look at them, chord 1, because it's major, is capital. Chord 2 is minor, so it must be in the small letters. Chord 3 is also small letters. Chord 4 is major, so they're capitals. Chord 5 is capital because it's major. Chord 6 is minor, so they're small letters. And chord 7 is diminished, small letters, and the little 0. Here is the minor key. Now, the minor key is very much more complicated than the major key, and you'll see this. The first chord is a minor chord. The second chord is diminished. The third chord is augmented, so it gets the little plus. The fourth chord is minor. The fifth chord is major. The sixth chord is major. The seventh chord is diminished. And the first chord, of course, is minor. If we were to put the major and the minor keys next to each other, let's say we have D major and D minor, we'd notice that there are only 3 chords that are exactly the same. In fact, only 2 chords that are exactly the same. That is chord 5 and chord 7. The rest of the chords are different between the major and the minor key. Also have a look at this example where I've labeled the chords in D minor. If you look at the screen now, you'll see that for the Western staff notation version, I've used a small d instead of a capital D. And this indicates that the small d tells us that we're working with D minor. If it was a capital D, we'd be working with D major. Just remember that when you are working with the Western staff notation version, you're going to be using capital letters for the major and small letters for the minor. All right. Now, we're going to be writing, for the rest of this semester, we're going to be writing triads in 4 parts. Now, you might be thinking, okay, there's a problem here. A triad only has 3 notes, but you're asking us to write in 4 parts. How are we going to do this? Well, for the purposes of learning how to harmonize melodies using triads, we use the convention that we are writing the exercises out for a choir, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. They're always, or almost always, 4 parts in a choir, and you'll be familiar with that: soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. We also call it SATB just for short. Okay. In jazz, though, we also use 4-part quite a lot, and sometimes we write it out in piano. You'll see in your textbook, I've given you a version of what 4-part harmony would look like in jazz. Okay, so just check in your textbook. If we are using triads, the combination of 3 notes simultaneously, we will always be 1 note short when harmonizing for 4 parts. So we've got 3 notes, but we've got 4 parts. So we're going to have to double notes occasionally. When you are using major triads, we double either the root note or the 5th note. And I'll show you how this is done. So don't panic yet, but just remember that major triads, you double the root or the 5th. In a C major triad, you've got C, E, and G. C is the root, E is the 3rd, G is the 5th. It's a major triad, so you could double the C or the G. That's what it means, okay? In minor triads, you can only double the 3rd. So a minor triad, for example, in C major, is the supertonic triad, which is D, F, A. Okay? D is the root, F is the 3rd, and A is the 5th. It's a minor triad, so you can only do the 3rd, which is F. So remember, look for which triads are major and which triads are minor. In the major key, chord 1, chord 4, and chord 5 are major triads. In the minor key, in the major key, chord 2, chord 3, and chord 6 are minor triads. And those are the only triads that you would be working with at the moment. Okay? Now, the other important thing for us to remember is that if we're imagining that we're writing for a choir, not all voice parts have unlimited range. Sopranos have a range from about middle C all the way up to top A. Okay, so that's the kind of note, those are the kind of notes that you can write within for the sopranos. For altos, you start a little bit lower, A going up to a D. Tenors, in the bass clef, we're going to write them from C in the bass clef to about C or maybe mid E. You can take them probably up to E actually. And for the basses, all the way down to E below the stave and to a middle C. When we write 4 parts on 2 staves, so this is an important thing. We learned about the grand stave earlier on in Introduction to Music Fundamentals A. The grand stave, you'll remember, is when we write the treble clef and the bass clef together. They're linked by that line and the bracket at the beginning. So when we're writing 4-part harmony, we use the grand stave. But we're going to write 4 parts on 2 staves. So that means 2 parts per stave. So the soprano and the alto voices are always going to be in the treble clef. And the tenor and the bass are going to be in the bass clef. When the 2 voices share a stave, the stem for the higher voices note always goes up, and the stem for the lower voice points downwards. We've already learned that the stem of a note is determined by whether it is above or below the middle line, okay, of the stave. Now we let go of that rule when you are writing 4-part harmony, because we need the stems to indicate which voice part you are working with. Okay, so let's just have a look at an example of what that would be. Look at your screen now. You'll see that the soprano note has the tail going upwards, while the alto note has its tail going downwards. Normally, the alto note, which is an F, the tail would go upwards, wouldn't it? Because it's below the middle line. But to indicate that this is the alto note, when two notes are written on the same stave together, we make the stem go down. If you look at the bottom stave, the tenor and the basses, you'll see that the middle C, the line goes, or the stem goes upwards. Normally, a middle C, the stem would go downwards because it is above the middle line. But because we're indicating that this is the tenor part, its stem must go upwards while the bass must go downwards. You'll also see that's how we write the grand stave. Both of the staves are linked together by a line on the far left, and then there's that brace or like a bracket sign which links the treble clef and the bass clef. And that's where we end this video.